Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The gym buzzed with excitement as the middle schoolers shuffled through drills, their sneakers squeaking on the polished wood floor. It was just another day at the YMCA basketball camp. The air was thick with the energy of young athletes, each eager to show off their skills in front of coaches who occasionally called out instructions or gave feedback. The players were all in their own worlds, focused, competitive, and thinking they were the next big thing in basketball. But none of them knew that their world was about to shift dramatically. Michael Jordan had walked into the gym without fanfare, a man in a hoodie and baseball cap blending in with the crowd. No one noticed him at first. He was just another guy, an older one at that, looking like he might be visiting a grandchild or checking in on a family member. The camp kids, most no older than 13, paid him little attention as they ran through dribbling exercises or shot free throws. After all, he looked just like any other man in his mid-50s, someone who had likely seen his prime years pass him by. For Michael, this was the perfect disguise. He had been known all over the world as MJ, a living legend in basketball, but in this moment, he wanted to be a nobody. He wasn't here to flaunt his identity or bask in the fame that had followed him for decades. He was here to learn, observe, and, most importantly, teach. At first, there were only whispers in the gym, the sound of basketballs bouncing against the floor and the occasional laughter as kids tried trick shots. MJ sat on the sidelines, watching with a calm, composed demeanor that contrasted sharply with the hyperactive energy of the camp. He took in everything, the eager young players practicing their jump shots, their hurried attempts at perfecting their crossover dribbles, their competitive spirit. One of the coaches walked by and nodded, giving MJ a glance that was somewhere between curiosity and indifference. "You here for the camp?" the coach asked casually, already moving to the next group of players without waiting for a response. MJ simply nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice smooth and low. He wasn't here to make an entrance. The kids were busy with their routines, focused on the drills, working hard to improve their skills. They were in the zone, completely unaware of who was standing right in front of them. For a brief moment, MJ allowed himself to blend into the background. The last thing he wanted was to disrupt the flow of the camp. He wasn't here to make them nervous or distracted. But, of course, that wasn't going to last long. One of the camp's more outgoing kids, a tall, lanky player named Zach, caught sight of him. Zach had been watching the older kids around the gym, sizing up his competition, and making mental notes about his own game. When he noticed MJ sitting on the bleachers, he nudged his friend beside him. "Look at this guy," Zach said, trying to suppress a grin. "What's he doing here? Looks like some old dude wandered in. Probably thinks he can still play." His friend laughed, not taking Zach's comment too seriously. "Yeah, right," his friend shot back. "Maybe he thinks he's some kind of ex-player who wants to relive his glory days." Zach stared at MJ for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing. The older man hadn't done anything remarkable yet. Just sat there, watching the kids with an air of quiet confidence that, to Zach, seemed like the kind of thing an out-of-touch former athlete might do. He turned back to his friends, completely unaware that the man he was talking about was none other than Michael Jordan. Across the gym, MJ glanced up as Zach and his friends continued to make jokes at his expense. He didn't react, keeping his focus on the drills. But he could hear them. He heard it all before. The skepticism. The doubts. The snide remarks. It didn't bother him, in fact, it made him smile internally. The time for proving himself on the court had long passed. But today, he had a different lesson to impart. As the kids ran through their exercises, one of the coaches blew the whistle and called for a quick break. The players all scattered to the sidelines for water. MJ seized the opportunity. He stood up, stretching his legs, and walked over to the nearest court, where a small group of kids was getting ready for a shooting drill. They were practicing layups, their form not quite there yet. MJ approached one of the kids, a sharp-eyed player named Jason who had been struggling with his shots. "You want to work on that layup?" MJ asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Jason looked up, confused at first. This guy? He seemed a little too old to be offering advice on basketball. Yeah, sure, I guess, he replied, not knowing who he was talking to. MJ showed him a few tips on how to approach the basket, focusing on the subtle mechanics of a layup that most of the kids overlooked in their haste to score. He broke it down slowly, making sure Jason understood every step. The other kids started to gather around, curious about this mysterious figure offering guidance. Stay low, protect the ball, MJ said, demonstrating the move with ease, his body fluid and strong despite his age. Don't rush it. Let the game come to you. Jason tried the drill again, this time improving noticeably. MJ's advice had made a difference. The kids around him began to watch more closely, their initial skepticism replaced by curiosity. After a few more tips, MJ moved to the next court, where a group of older kids was engaged in a shooting competition. They were messing around, seeing who could hit the most difficult shots. The atmosphere was competitive but lighthearted. No one seemed to notice the man standing behind them until he tapped one of the kids on the shoulder. Mind if I try? MJ asked, his voice quiet but firm. The kid, a tall, lanky boy named Ethan, turned around, sizing up the older man. Sure, Ethan replied with a grin, clearly not thinking much of it. But it's not as easy as it looks. MJ nodded and took a spot behind the three-point line. The kid stood back, watching the old man prepare for his shot. He dribbled the ball twice, then sank a clean shot. The kids didn't react. After all, it was just a three-pointer, nothing special. He took another shot, this time from further out. Swish. Another clean basket. The kids exchanged glances, raising their eyebrows in surprise, but they still weren't quite sure what was happening. Then, to their amazement, MJ took a step back, stood still for a moment, and lined up for a half-court shot. The kids started to murmur, but no one said a word as they watched. With a slight smile on his face, MJ closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and released the ball. The gym went dead silent. The ball sailed through the air, landing in the hoop with a soft swish. The room erupted in disbelief. The kids stared in shock, their jaws nearly hitting the floor. Ethan's grin faded, and his face turned bright red with embarrassment. He had just seen something no one expected, a half-court shot with eyes closed. Impossible, they thought. It wasn't just that MJ had made the shot. It was how effortlessly he had done it. And that was the moment when they all started to realize something incredible was happening. The old guy wasn't just some out-of-touch has-been. He was something more. They had no idea just yet, but they were about to find out. The kids gathered around MJ now, asking him questions, their skepticism giving way to awe. Who was he really? How had he done that? What else could he teach them? MJ simply smiled, his eyes twinkling. The real lesson was just beginning. As the gym's energy shifted, whispers spread like wildfire. The kids gathered around Michael Jordan, their excitement palpable. They had witnessed something few people had ever seen, a man who seemed to defy logic, making half-court shots with his eyes closed. The lingering silence in the gym was broken by a few scattered voices. Did you see that? One of the kids said, still in shock. I knew he was good, but not like that, another added, shaking his head. MJ stood casually, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking as composed as ever. He wasn't basking in the glory of the moment. He was letting the kids process what they had just seen. His mind wasn't on the shot or on proving anything to them. It was on how to use this moment to teach them something far more important. As the murmurs died down, one of the older boys, Zach, stepped forward. He was a competitive kid, tall with a confident swagger that made him stand out among the others. But now, his usual bravado seemed to waver. All right, Zach said, trying to mask his awe with a challenging tone. That was impressive. But can you do it again? You know, without cheating or whatever. MJ smiled softly, sensing the underlying challenge in Zach's voice. I don't need to do it again, son, he replied, his voice steady. The question is, what did you learn from watching me? Zach stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The shot had been something out of a highlight reel, a shot that even the most seasoned players would have struggled to make. But MJ wasn't giving him the easy answer. He wasn't interested in showing off. He wanted to teach, and he wanted the kids to understand that greatness wasn't about doing the impossible, it was about mastering the basics. MJ walked over to the basket, grabbed the ball, and dribbled it a few times before taking his shot, this one, a simple mid-range jumper. It swished cleanly through the net. No fanfare, no dramatic build-up. Just a smooth shot, effortlessly executed. Focus on the fundamentals, MJ said, his voice low but firm. Everything else will fall into place. Zach, still processing the earlier moment, watched him closely. He had seen the highlight reels. He had heard the stories. But being face-to-face with Michael Jordan, the man who had defined basketball for a generation, was something else entirely. Zach had grown up hearing about MJ's greatness, his 6 championships, his iconic performances in the finals. But here, in this gym, there was a new level to that greatness. It wasn't about the accolades. It was about what MJ had done, and still was doing, on the court in front of him. The other kids were still caught in the shock of seeing MJ make the impossible seem simple. Some started to approach him, tentatively at first, as if they were afraid of disturbing the legend. But MJ was no longer just a figure from their TV screens. He was a teacher, one who was quietly challenging them to rethink what they thought they knew about basketball and about themselves. As the session continued, MJ began to move from one group to another, offering advice in his calm, steady way. His instructions were simple but effective. To one group, he offered tips on footwork and positioning. To another, he broke down the mechanics of a jump shot. The kids who had initially been skeptical of him now listened intently, hanging on to his every word. They had come to this camp to improve their skills, but they were getting a lesson in something far more valuable: how to be great. While the kids worked on their skills, the coaches couldn't help but watch from the sidelines. They had noticed the shift, too. MJ's presence had done something to the atmosphere in the gym, something that no drill or motivational speech could have accomplished. The players were more focused, more engaged, as if they had tapped into a new level of their own potential. It wasn't just the drills, it was MJ himself, his approach to the game, his attitude. One of the coaches, Coach Stevens, leaned over to his assistant and whispered, "You think they have any idea who that is?" The assistant shook his head. "I'm not sure. But they're definitely listening to him." The conversation might have seemed insignificant to the kids, who were too absorbed in their drills to notice. But it was a reminder of how rare this moment truly was. In a world of basketball icons and celebrity, Michael Jordan was still a figure who inspired awe. And today, in this gym, he was once again proving why. The kids, slowly but surely, began to realize that they weren't just learning basketball techniques, they were learning the mindset of a champion. MJ's calmness, his ability to stay focused even when all eyes were on him, became an example they could follow. This wasn't about flashy dunks or making highlight reel plays. It was about consistency. Hard work. Mastery of the craft. One of the quieter kids, Jason, approached MJ during a break in the action. He had been one of the players who struggled the most with his shots, constantly missing, his form off. But now, he was asking for help, something that had been difficult for him to do before. "Can you show me how to fix my shot?" Jason asked, his voice unsure. MJ gave him a reassuring nod and walked over to the basket. "Let's take a look," he said. "You're not far off, but there's one key thing you're missing: your follow-through." He stood behind Jason, gently adjusting his form. "You're releasing the ball too early," MJ explained. "Focus on your follow-through. Hold that position for a second after you let it go." Jason took another shot, this time with the adjusted technique. The ball hit the rim, bouncing out, but there was a noticeable improvement in his form. Jason looked back at MJ, a mixture of frustration and hope in his eyes. "It's going to take time," MJ said, offering a small smile. "But you've got the right mindset. You're willing to work. That's what separates good from great." As Jason stepped back to try again, MJ turned his attention to Zach, who had been watching the entire exchange. Zach still had that cocky edge to him, but there was something different in the way he was watching MJ now. He had seen MJ fix Jason's form with a few simple adjustments. He had seen how MJ's calm, measured approach was making the kids better. And Zach had a realization: this wasn't just about physical talent. This was about the approach. It was about focus. About doing the little things right every single time. Without warning, Zach approached MJ again, this time with a new tone in his voice. "All right, man," he said, "show me how it's done. I want to see how you shoot." MJ raised an eyebrow. He wasn't offended. In fact, he was pleased. This was exactly what he had been waiting for, a moment where the kids weren't just watching him passively, but actively engaging with him. "You want to see it?" MJ said, stepping back to the three-point line. "All right. But remember, this is about precision, not flair." With that, he took the shot, effortlessly sinking it. Then he stepped back, waiting for Zach to take his turn. The gym was quiet for a moment, the only sound the faint echo of the basketball bouncing on the floor. The kids were watching. MJ wasn't showing off. He was simply demonstrating how a great shot looked when it was executed with the right form and mentality. Zach, still processing everything he had seen so far, took his shot. It missed. But the moment wasn't about the miss, it was about what came next. Zach knew, just like the others, that with the right focus, with the right effort, they could all improve. And in that moment, they all began to understand something crucial: greatness wasn't about being perfect. It was about continuously striving to be better. The lesson had only just begun. The atmosphere in the gym had shifted from casual to electric. The kids were no longer going through the motions of practice, they were engaged, focused, and determined. Michael Jordan had sparked something within them that was impossible to ignore. His presence had done more than just motivate them, it had shown them what true commitment to the game looked like. As the drills continued, the kids worked with a renewed energy, their movements sharper, more purposeful. They weren't just aiming for the basket anymore, they were aiming for greatness. Zach, who had initially been skeptical about MJ's presence, was now leading the charge. His earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. He wasn't just trying to impress his friends anymore. He was trying to match MJ's level of precision, and that, in itself, was an entirely new challenge. The ball slipped from his hands as he tried to hit another difficult shot, the same one MJ had made so effortlessly earlier. But this time, instead of getting frustrated, he paused, took a deep breath, and reset. MJ, watching from the sidelines, nodded approvingly. Zach had learned something important. It wasn't just about making the shot, it was about the process, the approach, and the mindset that led up to it. That was the real lesson. As the practice continued, MJ's role shifted from player to mentor. The kids began to gather around him after each drill, eagerly asking questions. Some asked about his career, about the iconic moments they had seen on television or heard about in stories. Others asked about the mental side of the game, how he handled the pressure, the expectations, the defeats. MJ didn't dive into lengthy anecdotes about his glory days. Instead, he kept it simple, speaking in short, powerful statements that conveyed far more than any drawn-out explanation could. "You don't win games by focusing on what you're going to do in the fourth quarter," he said to a group of kids practicing free throws. "You win by making sure every shot, every pass, every play, counts." It was a mantra he had lived by his entire career. The success he had achieved wasn't just the result of natural talent, it was the product of consistent, relentless effort. That's what he wanted the kids to understand. Talent was important, but without the right mindset, it would only take them so far. They had to be willing to put in the work, day in and day out. Jason, the quieter kid who had struggled with his shot earlier, was now one of the more vocal players in the group. He had already made noticeable progress, his form improving with each attempt. But he still had doubts. There was a part of him that wondered if he could really make it, if he could really become good enough. It wasn't about just getting the technique right. It was about overcoming the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough. He approached MJ again during a break, this time with more confidence. "How do you deal with the pressure?" Jason asked, his voice a little shakier than he'd hoped. MJ looked down at him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Pressure," he said slowly, "is what you make of it. It's not something that's out of your control. It's about how you react to the pressure. The key is to embrace it, not run from it." Jason nodded, taking in the words. MJ's advice was simple, but it held a weight that Jason could feel deep down. The pressure wasn't something he could avoid, but he could control how he responded to it. The rest of the kids continued their drills, but now there was a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about doing the drills for the sake of it. They understood that every rep was a step toward improvement. Every time they missed a shot, they weren't failing, they were learning. They began to embrace the struggle, seeing it as an integral part of the process. MJ moved from one group to another, never staying in one place for too long. He wasn't the type of mentor who needed to dominate the conversation or take the spotlight. He was content to let the kids work through their challenges, offering guidance only when it was needed. It was a subtle approach, but it was effective. He wasn't just teaching them how to shoot or dribble, he was teaching them how to think like a champion. As the day wore on, the kids started to warm up to him in ways they hadn't before. They were no longer intimidated by his presence. They saw him as a coach, a mentor, someone who had been where they were and had worked his way to the top. But more than that, they saw him as someone who genuinely cared about their growth. His interactions with them were personal and genuine. He wasn't just handing out generic advice. He was tailoring his guidance to each individual, understanding their strengths and weaknesses. Zach, who had been the most resistant at the start of the day, was now fully immersed in the experience. He had worked on his shooting technique, refining his form with MJ's help. He was still competitive, still trying to outdo the others, but now it wasn't about proving himself. It was about pushing himself to become better, to reach a level of skill and focus that he hadn't thought possible before. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of failing. He knew that failure was part of the journey. The gym was filled with the sound of basketballs bouncing, sneakers squeaking on the hardwood, and the occasional shout of encouragement. The kids were in their element, their focus sharper than it had been all day. Even the coaches, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, couldn't help but be impressed. They had seen their fair share of camps and clinics, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just about the drills. It was about the mindset that Michael Jordan had instilled in them. The kids were no longer just going through the motions, they were invested in their own growth. And that was the true power of MJ's visit. As the session came to a close, MJ called the kids together for a final huddle. They had worked hard all day, and it was time to wrap things up. The gym was buzzing with the afterglow of a day spent learning from one of the greatest players to ever step on a basketball court. The kids were tired but satisfied. They had come a long way in a single day. MJ looked at them with a mix of pride and encouragement. "You've all taken a step in the right direction today," he said. "But this is just the beginning. You have to keep working. Keep pushing yourself. The game will always be there, but it's up to you to decide how far you're willing to go." The kids stood there for a moment, taking in his words. There was no applause, no standing ovation. But in that silence, they all understood what he meant. The lesson wasn't about a single shot or a single game. It was about a lifelong commitment to the craft, to the pursuit of greatness. MJ had given them a glimpse of what it took to reach the top. The rest was up to them. As they gathered their things and filed out of the gym, the air was thick with a new sense of purpose. For some of them, this would be the spark that ignited their basketball careers. For others, it would be the catalyst for a lifelong love of the game. But one thing was certain, they would never forget this day. The day Michael Jordan walked into their camp and showed them what it truly meant to be great. As the gym emptied and the kids trickled out, there was a noticeable change in the air. The usual chaos of a day at camp, kids yelling, sneakers squeaking, basketballs bouncing, had quieted down, replaced by a new kind of energy. The kids were quieter now, more introspective, as they processed everything that had happened over the course of the day. Michael Jordan had come in as a mystery and left as something much greater, a living example of the power of hard work, dedication, and the right mindset. Zach was one of the last kids to leave the gym. He lingered for a moment, standing just beyond the threshold, his eyes still glued to the court. His hands were stuffed into his hoodie pockets as he replayed the day in his mind. It had started off as just another camp, another day to show off his skills and see if he could outdo the others. But now, he understood that it was about much more than that. He had always been the confident one, the kid who prided himself on his ability to shoot from anywhere, the one who would challenge anyone to a game, no matter the odds. But today, MJ had shown him something he had never considered. The way to truly improve wasn't through arrogance or self-satisfaction. It was through humility, focus, and relentless effort. Zach had spent the day trying to match MJ's level of composure, trying to replicate the precision with which he moved on the court. But it wasn't just about trying to copy him. It was about learning how to be his best self. Zach turned back one last time, casting a long look across the court. There was something in him that had clicked. He felt more grounded now, more focused. The reality of how much work he still had to do, how much further he could push himself, was hitting him hard. He wasn't the best player here, not yet. But with the right mindset, he could get there. As he walked out of the gym, the warm evening air hit him, but it couldn't shake the feeling of transformation that lingered inside. MJ hadn't just taught him how to improve his shot, he had shown him how to approach life with a level of focus and dedication that could translate far beyond basketball. Jason was another kid who couldn't shake the feeling of the day. He had always been quiet, often overlooked, but something about Michael Jordan's presence had made him feel seen. It wasn't that MJ had singled him out, it was more subtle than that. Through every word, every action, MJ had treated him like a player, like someone who could rise to the occasion. When Jason had approached him for help with his shot, MJ hadn't dismissed him. He hadn't belittled him for missing so many shots earlier. Instead, he had given him guidance, encouragement, and the tools to improve. Jason had never believed in his own potential the way he did now. The doubt that had always followed him, was he really good enough, had started to fade. He had spent so many years trying to fit in, trying to prove himself in the eyes of others. But MJ had shown him that the only person he needed to prove anything to was himself. The work didn't stop after one good day of practice. The real challenge was consistency. As Jason walked back to his cabin, he thought about what MJ had said, embrace the pressure, don't run from it. Those words rang in his mind. In the past, he had been afraid of failure, afraid that if he missed too many shots, people would see him as less than the others. But MJ's approach was different. MJ wasn't afraid to fail. In fact, he used it to propel himself forward, using every missed shot as fuel for the next attempt. Jason now understood that failure wasn't the end, it was part of the process. Meanwhile, Coach Stevens and his assistant stayed behind to lock up the gym, their conversation picking up where it had left off earlier in the day. "I've been coaching for over 20 years, Coach Stevens said, his voice low, and I've never seen a shift like that before. Not just in their skills, but in their mentality." His assistant nodded, still trying to process what had just unfolded. "You think it was just him being here, or something more?" "Both," Coach Stevens said, pausing as he locked up the doors. "It's one thing to be around a legend, to see him in action. But it's another thing entirely when that legend takes the time to teach. Jordan didn't just show them how to play basketball. He showed them how to approach life, how to handle adversity. These kids are never going to forget this." The coach paused and looked out at the gym, where the echoes of the day's drills still seemed to linger in the empty space. "We've been teaching these kids skills for years. But today, they learned something much deeper. His assistant let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, they learned what it takes to be great. Back in the locker room, the kids gathered their things slowly, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The usual post-practice chatter was quieter than usual. Even the loudest kids were subdued, their minds working through everything they had learned. They had all come to camp expecting to improve their game. They had all expected to leave with better techniques, maybe a few tips on how to get noticed by scouts or make a highlight reel play. But they were leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be great. For most of them, basketball was a dream. But after today, they understood that greatness wasn't handed to you, it was earned. The road was long, and the work never stopped. But they had been shown the path. And now it was up to them to walk it. As the night wore on, the sound of basketballs bouncing had faded, replaced by the quiet conversations of kids who were now reflecting on the lesson they had just received. It wasn't the kind of lesson that could be measured in stats or rankings. It wasn't something that could be charted on a graph or assessed with a simple drill. It was a lesson that could only be learned through experience, the kind of experience that changed the way you saw yourself and the world around you. The gym had emptied out, but Michael Jordan's presence still lingered in the air. It wasn't just his basketball skills that had left an impression. It was his mindset. It was the way he had approached every challenge, every moment of adversity, and had come out stronger on the other side. That was the true lesson, how to embrace the grind, how to stay focused when it seemed impossible, and how to rise again after every fall. As the kids drifted off to bed that night, they carried with them something more than the drills and tips they had learned. They carried with them the understanding that success was a product of resilience, discipline, and a willingness to face failure head-on. They had seen greatness up close, not in the form of flashy dunks or impossible shots, but in the quiet, relentless pursuit of excellence. And that was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The camp might have ended, but for these kids, the real journey had just begun. They had learned how to be great, not just on the court, but in everything they did. They had learned that greatness wasn't about the shots you made, it was about the effort you put in, the challenges you overcame, and the mindset you carried with you every day. And as they fell asleep that night, they knew one thing for sure, the future was theirs for the taking. The morning after Michael Jordan's visit, the camp was abuzz. The kids, still riding the high of meeting their idol, were quietly excited as they walked into the gym for another day of practice. The normal energy of the camp had returned, but there was something different in the air. The kids were still competitive, still focused on their drills, but now there was an unspoken sense of respect for each other. They weren't just trying to beat each other anymore, they were pushing each other to improve, to be better, to match the standards they had seen the night before. Zach was the first to arrive, earlier than usual. He was usually the last one to roll in, the loudest in the locker room, trying to stir up some sort of playful chaos. But today, he was quiet, focused. His teammates noticed the difference immediately. He wasn't bragging about his skills or challenging anyone to a shooting contest. Instead, he was already on the court, practicing his dribbling, working on his footwork, and paying close attention to the details that had once seemed insignificant to him. It was clear to everyone that the previous day had affected him deeply. He had spent the night thinking about the lessons MJ had shared, especially the moments when Jordan had broken down his own approach to the game, how every movement, every decision, had a purpose. Zach realized that he had always relied on his raw talent, but that alone wouldn't take him where he wanted to go. If he wanted to be great, he would have to put in the work, focus on every aspect of his game, and embrace the grind. Jason, too, had woken up with a renewed sense of purpose. His shot wasn't perfect yet, but it was improving. His confidence had grown in small but significant ways. Yesterday, when MJ had worked with him one-on-one, Jason had felt like he was being seen for the first time as more than just a kid who struggled to make his shots. MJ had acknowledged his effort, his willingness to improve, and in doing so, had validated Jason's potential. That encouragement had given him a new outlook on the game and on himself. He wasn't afraid to keep failing because he knew now that failure wasn't something to fear. It was something to learn from. The coaches could see the shift as well. They had watched the kids for weeks, guiding them through drills, encouraging them to push harder, but they had never seen the level of focus they were witnessing now. There was a different kind of intensity in the air. The kids weren't just going through the motions. They were engaged, fully invested in the process of becoming better. Coach Stevens watched as Zach, Jason, and the others ran through their drills. He couldn't help but smile. He had seen athletes come and go over the years, but there was something special about the way the kids were responding now. It wasn't just about improving their shooting technique or learning new moves, it was about the way they were approaching the game as a whole. They had learned something more important than skills. They had learned how to approach life with discipline and perseverance, how to push through when things got tough, and how to embrace the challenge instead of backing away from it. As the session progressed, MJ's influence was clear. Every time a player made a mistake, they didn't hang their heads in frustration. Instead, they took a breath, reset, and tried again. They were learning to embrace their mistakes, seeing them not as failures, but as opportunities to grow. That shift in mentality was exactly what MJ had hoped to instill in them, an understanding that greatness didn't come from perfection, it came from resilience, from pushing through adversity, and from constantly striving to be better. Later that day, after the drills were finished, the kids gathered around the bench for a water break. Zach, who had been unusually quiet for most of the morning, turned to the others with a look of determination in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low but confident. "Yesterday wasn't just about making that half-court shot or showing us how to shoot. It was about how to handle the grind, how to stay focused when things aren't going right." The others nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They had all felt it, the shift in perspective that had taken place over the last 24 hours. They had been given a glimpse into what it meant to be truly great, and now, it was up to them to live up to that standard. "I'm not going to lie," Zach continued, "I used to think it was all about showing off, hitting the perfect shot, making the big play. But I see now that it's not about that. It's about the little things, the details. It's about the work you put in when no one's watching. And we can all do that. We just have to stay focused." The group was quiet for a moment, each of them reflecting on what Zach had said. The lessons they had learned over the past 2 days had sunk in deeper than they realized. They weren't just playing basketball, they were learning how to approach everything with the same mindset MJ had shown them: dedication, focus, and a relentless pursuit of improvement. As the camp neared its end, the kids had one final scrimmage. It wasn't the high-stakes game they might have imagined when they first signed up, but for these kids, it felt like the culmination of everything they had learned. The gym was filled with a sense of anticipation as the teams lined up, ready to play. The atmosphere was different from the start of the camp. There were no egos, no loud boasts. Everyone was on the same page, focused on playing the game the right way. The game was intense, each team pushing hard for every point, but it wasn't just about winning. It was about playing with purpose, playing with discipline. Every pass, every shot, every move had meaning. And when the final buzzer sounded, the teams stood together, sweaty and exhausted, but proud. They had given everything they had, not just in the game, but in everything they had done leading up to it. Coach Stevens called the kids together one last time before they left for the day. "I've been doing this for a long time," he began, "and I've never seen a group of players so committed, so focused. You've all grown more in the last 2 days than I've seen in most players over the course of a whole season. I don't know what you'll do with this, but I know one thing: you've all learned what it means to be great. And that's something that will stick with you long after this camp is over." The kids stood there, soaking in his words. They knew what he meant. They had learned how to approach the game with a mindset that was bigger than basketball. They had learned that greatness wasn't just about talent or accolades, it was about the work you put in, the attitude you carried with you, and the way you handled both success and failure. As they walked off the court for the last time, there was no fanfare. There were no cameras or applause. But there was something even more valuable, an understanding of what it took to be truly great. They had seen it firsthand. They had witnessed the relentless drive, the unwavering focus, and the commitment to improvement that had made Michael Jordan a legend. And as they left the gym that afternoon, they knew that this was only the beginning. The lessons they had learned were just the start of a much longer journey. The path to greatness was long, and it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready for it. The fire that MJ had ignited in them wasn't going out anytime soon. They had learned how to be great, not just as basketball players, but as people. And that would carry them far beyond the gym. The day after the scrimmage, the mood in the camp was noticeably different. The sense of camaraderie had deepened, and it wasn't just because of the final game. The kids had begun to understand that they were part of something bigger than just a summer basketball camp. They were learning what it took to be successful, not just in basketball, but in whatever they set their minds to. Michael Jordan had given them a glimpse of a mindset that went beyond sports. It was a mindset that could be applied to any area of life. Zach, who had once been the loudest and most competitive kid in the camp, was now more reserved, more focused. The fire he had once directed outward in the form of trash talk and challenges was now being channeled inward. He spent his free time working on his jump shot, refining the small things he had previously overlooked. His pride, which had always driven him to show off, was now being replaced by a quieter confidence. He wasn't just trying to impress others anymore, he was trying to impress himself. He wasn't looking for instant results, he understood now that the path to greatness was a slow and steady climb. Jason, who had struggled with his shot for so long, had seen a transformation too. He was no longer the quiet, unsure player he had once been. He had begun to realize that it wasn't about whether or not he made the shot, it was about the effort he put into every single one. Every miss wasn't a failure, it was just another chance to get better. He wasn't afraid of failure anymore. In fact, he saw it as a necessary part of the journey. The confidence MJ had instilled in him had seeped into every part of his game. He wasn't just a player with potential now, he was a player who believed he could reach that potential. As the days went on, the camp's atmosphere became more intense, not because of the competition, but because of the collective drive to improve. The kids weren't just showing up for practice, they were committed to making progress. They were more focused, more disciplined, and more engaged in every drill. The coaches, who had seen countless kids come and go, noticed the difference immediately. They saw a group of players who were no longer just trying to get through the day, they were genuinely striving to get better. Coach Stevens had always prided himself on being a good coach, but even he could admit that this summer had been different. He had always believed in hard work and the importance of fundamentals. But the kids had shown him something more. They had shown him the power of mentality. The lesson that Michael Jordan had taught them wasn't just about basketball, it was about life. It was about how you approach everything, whether you're facing an opponent, a challenge, or even yourself. It was about resilience and self-belief. One afternoon, Coach Stevens decided to sit down with the group. They had just finished a particularly grueling set of drills, and he wanted to take a moment to reflect on how far they had come. "I've been doing this for years," Coach Stevens began, "and I've seen plenty of talented players come and go. But I've never seen a group of kids who were more focused, more willing to put in the work. What you've learned here is more than just basketball. You've learned what it means to commit to something, to give it everything you have, every day. And that's what will carry you through, no matter where you go." The kids were silent, taking in his words. They were all tired, but the exhaustion felt different now. It wasn't the tiredness of having to push through drills for the sake of it, it was the tiredness of growth, of improvement. They had learned to embrace the grind. They had learned that the work didn't stop after one good session, one great game, or one perfect shot. It was about consistency. It was about what you did every day when no one was watching. Jason looked around at his teammates, feeling the weight of Coach Stevens' words. He realized now that he wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing for all of them. They had become a team in the truest sense of the word, not just because they were practicing together, but because they were pushing each other to be better every day. They had learned that basketball was a team sport, but it was also an individual pursuit. Everyone had their own path to walk, their own growth to experience. But together, they were stronger. Zach, who had always prided himself on his ability to do it alone, now understood the importance of the group. He wasn't just working to improve his own game anymore, he was working to improve the team. It wasn't about being the best player on the court, it was about being the best player for the team. The team had to come first, and individual success would follow. The realization was subtle but powerful. It wasn't about the flashy moments, the dunks, or the last-second shots. It was about the small, everyday actions that led to improvement. It was about the mindset that turned setbacks into opportunities, and it was about the work you put in when no one was watching. As the week drew to a close, the kids found themselves in a final scrimmage. This time, there was no pressure to win, no expectation to impress the coaches or the other kids. It wasn't about showing off or trying to prove anything. It was about putting everything they had learned into practice, about executing the skills they had worked on, and applying the mentality they had adopted. The game was fast-paced, intense, but it was also more fluid than any of the games they had played before. The kids were moving as a unit, anticipating each other's movements, communicating without words. They weren't just reacting to what was happening on the court, they were in control. They were thinking ahead, reading the game with a new level of awareness. And when the final buzzer sounded, it wasn't the scores that mattered. What mattered was the way they had played. For the first time, they had played as a team, not just a group of individuals. They had learned that the greatest players were the ones who could elevate those around them. They had seen that greatness wasn't just about talent, it was about effort, discipline, and mindset. And they had witnessed it all firsthand, from the man who had embodied greatness for so many years. Coach Stevens gathered them together one last time, a smile on his face. "You've all grown so much," he said. "You've learned what it means to push yourself, to fail, and to keep going. And I'm proud of each one of you for sticking with it. But remember this is just the beginning. You're going to face challenges, setbacks, and moments where you question whether you have what it takes. But if you keep that same mentality, if you keep working, you can achieve whatever you set your mind to." The kids stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of Coach Stevens' words. They had come into the camp looking for ways to improve their skills, to become better players. But what they had walked away with was something far more valuable. They had learned how to approach everything with a mindset of excellence, how to push through adversity, and how to continue growing no matter the obstacles in front of them. As they walked off the court, there was no grand farewell, no fireworks or trophies. But the lessons they had learned over the past week would stay with them forever. They had seen what it took to be truly great. And now, they were ready to go out and apply those lessons in everything they did. Their journey had only just begun, but they were prepared for whatever came next. As the last day of camp approached, there was a quiet intensity among the kids that hadn't been there before. For most of them, it was their final opportunity to showcase the lessons they had absorbed over the last few days. They were no longer just going through the motions of practice, they were determined to prove to themselves, and to each other, that they had learned something valuable. The excitement that had initially come from being in a basketball camp had now shifted. It was no longer about impressing others or showing off. It was about the pursuit of improvement, about living up to the standards they had set for themselves. Zach was among the first to hit the court. His usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by an unshakable focus. He was no longer the loudest player on the court, the one trying to be the center of attention. Instead, he was the one working silently, honing his moves and refining the details that had once seemed trivial. He understood now that basketball wasn't just about making flashy plays, it was about doing the small things well. It was about consistency, about showing up every day with the same hunger to improve. Jason, too, had found a new sense of purpose. His shot was far from perfect, but it was better. What was more important now was his attitude. No longer consumed by self-doubt, Jason approached each drill with a quiet confidence. He didn't expect perfection, he understood now that the path to greatness was paved with mistakes and learning. He had taken MJ's words to heart, failure wasn't the end, but a part of the process. Every miss was an opportunity to improve, every setback a chance to get better. Coach Stevens stood at the sidelines, watching his players closely. He had seen a dramatic transformation over the past few days. The same kids who had come to camp, eager to show off and prove themselves, were now playing with a deeper understanding of the game. They had moved past their egos. They were no longer just individuals trying to shine on the court, they were a team, working together toward a common goal. Coach Stevens couldn't help but feel proud of how far they had come. But he knew that the real test wouldn't come from their last day of practice. It would come from how they carried these lessons with them when they left the gym and returned to their everyday lives. The morning practice had been intense. The kids worked on their dribbling, their shooting, and their footwork, but there was a noticeable difference. It wasn't just about getting through the drills. It was about focusing on every detail, doing each repetition with purpose. The camp had become less about competing against each other and more about competing against themselves. They weren't just trying to impress the coaches or other players anymore. They were trying to improve every aspect of their game. As the practice came to a close, Coach Stevens gathered the kids together. He could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't done yet, they still had work to do, even if the camp was almost over. He looked at them, a proud smile on his face. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice steady. "You've all made incredible progress. You've learned what it means to push yourself, to fail, and to rise again. But that's just the beginning. This game doesn't stop when you leave this gym. Everything you've learned here, every lesson you've absorbed, will follow you. The real test will be what you do when no one is watching, when there's no coach there to remind you of your goals. Are you going to keep pushing? Are you going to stay focused, even when it gets hard?" The kids nodded, their eyes fixed on him. They understood what he was saying. The lessons they had learned over the past week weren't something they could just walk away from. They had learned that greatness wasn't about talent alone, it was about effort, mindset, and consistency. It was about showing up every day, putting in the work, and pushing through the tough times. They had seen it firsthand, in the way MJ had approached the game, in the way he had shown them that success didn't come overnight. It was earned through dedication and relentless pursuit of improvement. Later that afternoon, the camp held its final scrimmage. There was no pressure to win. There was no expectation to perform. It wasn't about proving who was the best player, it was about putting everything they had learned into practice. The game was fast-paced, but the focus was different. The kids were no longer thinking about scoring or making the highlight play. They were thinking about how to make the right pass, how to move without the ball, how to communicate with their teammates. They were thinking about the game in a way they never had before. Zach, who had always relied on his athleticism and natural ability, now understood the importance of teamwork and intelligence. He wasn't just looking to break ankles or make a flashy move, he was looking for the best play. He passed the ball when he saw an open teammate. He played defense with discipline. He wasn't the star of the game, he was just one piece of the puzzle. And he was okay with that. He knew now that the best players weren't the ones who always took the spotlight. They were the ones who made everyone around them better. Jason, too, was playing with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't afraid to take the shot anymore, but he also wasn't afraid to pass the ball when someone else had a better look. He had learned that it wasn't always about being the hero. Sometimes, it was about making the right play for the team. The game was no longer about individual accolades, it was about the collective effort. As the game came to a close, the kids gathered at center court, sweaty and exhausted but proud. They had played hard, but more importantly, they had played with a new sense of understanding. They had learned how to read the game, how to make the right decisions in the heat of the moment. They had learned how to work together as a team, how to put the team's success above their own. And they had learned what it meant to embrace the grind, to stay focused even when the going got tough. Coach Stevens called them together for a final meeting. "I've been coaching for a long time," he said, his voice steady, "and I've never been more proud of a group of players than I am of you all. You've learned what it means to push through the tough times. You've learned what it means to be a team. And you've learned how to improve, no matter what. But the real test starts now. The lessons you've learned here, those will stick with you, but it's up to you to carry them with you. The road to greatness doesn't end when this camp is over. It's just beginning. The kids stood there in silence for a moment, absorbing his words. They had come to camp expecting to work on their skills, to become better basketball players. But what they had learned went far beyond the game itself. They had learned how to approach everything in life with the same dedication and mindset. They had learned that greatness wasn't about the accolades or the wins, it was about the process, the work you put in, and the mindset you carried with you every day. As they walked out of the gym for the final time, the weight of the lessons they had learned hung in the air. They had grown as players, yes, but they had grown even more as individuals. They were no longer just kids trying to make a name for themselves. They were young athletes who understood that greatness was something you earned, day by day, through consistent effort and unwavering commitment. And as they walked off the court, they knew that this wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning. As the last day of camp arrived, the final moments had a feeling of both closure and anticipation. The kids, though tired from the week's demanding schedule, were different. The competitive atmosphere that had defined the early days of the camp had mellowed into something deeper. It wasn't just about scoring the most points anymore, or being the standout player. It was about playing the game with a sense of purpose, of truly understanding the bigger picture. The time spent under the guidance of Coach Stevens and Michael Jordan had left a mark on them. They had learned that the game wasn't simply about talent. It was about mentality, discipline, and resilience. And that was the true takeaway. Zach, who had entered the camp with a chip on his shoulder, was now a changed player. His previous attitude had been about being the loudest, the most visible, the one who commanded attention. But after several days of observing MJ's quiet confidence and unrelenting focus, he understood that real greatness didn't need validation from others. Greatness spoke for itself. Zach now moved with purpose. He didn't need to be the loudest player, he simply let his actions speak for him. The hours he spent practicing after each session had paid off. His shots were more consistent, his dribbling smoother, and his understanding of the game much sharper. He wasn't just playing for the thrill of winning anymore. He was playing because he understood the journey, the countless hours of practice, the willingness to fail, and the courage to get back up and try again. And in that quiet determination, Zach had found something that surpassed the glory of winning, the satisfaction of knowing he was doing everything he could to be the best version of himself. Jason, too, had experienced a transformation. At the beginning of the camp, he had been the quiet one, often unsure of himself. His form was off, his shot inconsistent. He had doubted his own potential, fearing that maybe he didn't belong in the same camp as kids who seemed so much more skilled. But through his one-on-one sessions with MJ and the consistent support of the coaches, he had found a new confidence. Every day, his shot improved. His footwork became more refined. But more than that, his belief in himself grew. He learned that the road to success was built on persistence, not perfection. Jason was no longer intimidated by his mistakes. They had become lessons, opportunities to learn rather than sources of self-doubt. He realized that the true test wasn't how many shots you made or missed in a game, it was about how you responded to the ups and downs of your journey. Jason knew now that basketball was just as much about mental toughness as it was about physical ability. As the kids warmed up for the final scrimmage, the energy in the gym was focused, not frantic. They weren't looking to make the most impressive play or pull off something that would be remembered. They were looking to execute the fundamentals they had worked so hard to master, to play with purpose, and to finish what they had started. Coach Stevens, watching from the sidelines, saw how the kids had shifted in their approach. The same group of players who had arrived with eager, overconfident energy now moved with a quiet intensity. They had stopped trying to prove themselves to the others. Instead, they were proving something to themselves, that they could play the game the right way, and they could do it consistently. The game began, and the kids moved fluidly on the court. There were no extravagant individual plays, no forced heroics. Instead, there was a rhythm, a sense of teamwork, and a deep understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. They played with an unspoken trust, knowing that if one person missed, the next would pick up the slack. Zach moved off the ball with purpose, his passes sharp and calculated. Jason, once hesitant to take a shot, now confidently took open looks, knowing he had put in the work to get there. The game was intense, but not in the usual way. It wasn't about competing to outdo one another, it was about completing each other's efforts, trusting the process. The score didn't matter, and yet, somehow, it felt like the most important game they had played all week. Coach Stevens was proud of what he was seeing. The transformation wasn't just in their physical skills, it was in their mindset. They were playing with the maturity and focus that would serve them well long after this camp ended. This wasn't about short-term wins. This was about understanding the process, embracing the grind, and knowing that the lessons they had learned would be with them long after the basketball stopped bouncing. As the final whistle blew, the kids stood together, sweaty but satisfied. The game wasn't the point anymore. The way they played, the way they had come together as a team, was what mattered. Coach Stevens gathered them at center court, his eyes sweeping over the group of kids who had, in just a few days, learned more than most athletes learned in months of practice. "I couldn't be prouder of you all," he said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "You've shown what it means to be great players, not just because of the skills you've developed, but because of the mindset you've adopted. You've learned to embrace failure, to push through adversity, and to play for something bigger than yourselves. And those are the qualities that will take you further in life than any basketball game ever could." There was a quiet, reflective silence as the kids absorbed his words. They had spent the week focused on basketball, on improving their skills, but they had learned so much more. They had learned that greatness wasn't just about winning or scoring the most points. It was about the way you approached every aspect of your life, about showing up every day with the right attitude, and about putting in the hard work, even when it wasn't glamorous or easy. They had learned that the journey was just as important as the destination. As they walked off the court for the last time, the feeling of closure was bittersweet. They had come to camp as kids trying to prove themselves, but they were leaving as athletes who understood that the pursuit of greatness never truly ends. It was a journey, a process that required patience, persistence, and the willingness to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against them. Each of them knew that this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. They would carry these lessons with them, on the court and off. The hard work, the dedication, the humility, these were the qualities that would guide them in everything they did, from basketball to life. They had come to the camp hoping to improve their game, but what they had gained was far more valuable. They had learned how to approach life with purpose and dedication, and they had learned that greatness was a mindset, not a destination. As they walked out of the gym and back into the world beyond the court, they knew they had been given something priceless. And they were ready to take on whatever came next. The days after the camp wrapped up felt different. The kids returned to their normal lives, but there was a quiet shift within them. They carried the lessons they had learned, not just in their physical improvements, but in their mindset. It wasn't the type of transformation that was immediately noticeable. There were no dramatic changes overnight. It was subtle, a new sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of what it took to succeed. They had learned how to approach challenges, both on and off the court, with the same mentality they had seen Michael Jordan embody. It wasn't about playing the game for the accolades. It was about playing for the love of it, for the commitment to continuous improvement, and for the resilience to get back up after every fall. Zach had started to apply the lessons he'd learned almost immediately. He found himself looking at his practices differently. He didn't rush through them anymore, trying to get to the fun parts. Instead, he embraced the grind. The drills that had once felt like chores now felt like opportunities. When his shot didn't fall, he didn't hang his head in frustration. He corrected his form and tried again. And again. And again. Zach had stopped seeking shortcuts. He now understood that greatness wasn't about instant results, it was about sustained effort. And that effort had to come every day, no matter how tired or frustrated he felt. Zach's teammates began to notice the change in him. He was quieter now, more focused. The cocky arrogance he had once worn like a shield was replaced by a quiet confidence. He still played with the same intensity, but now it was channeled into making the right decisions on the court, whether it was taking a difficult shot or passing it to someone who had a better look. He was no longer trying to prove himself to anyone. He was proving something to himself. And that, more than anything, was the most important victory. Jason, too, had seen significant change in his approach to the game. At first, his improvement had been purely technical, his shot was smoother, his footwork more consistent. But the real change had been in how he carried himself. He no longer doubted his place on the court. He no longer feared failure. He saw each missed shot as a lesson, not a setback. He had taken MJ's advice to heart. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but learning from them. Basketball, like life, wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about showing up every day and doing the work, whether things were going your way or not. Jason had also become more vocal in practices, more confident in offering suggestions to his teammates or helping them with their own struggles. He had grown beyond just focusing on himself. He was now thinking about how to make everyone around him better. His teammates noticed the shift, too. They looked to him for leadership, knowing that he was no longer just a quiet player who doubted himself. He was a quiet player who had learned the value of persistence, and in that, he had become someone who others respected. The coaches, particularly Coach Stevens, had watched the kids with a sense of pride. He had been around long enough to know that real change didn't come easily. It took time, effort, and the right mindset. And he had seen all of that in this group. They had arrived with raw potential, but they had left with something far more valuable than skills alone. They had left with a mental toughness that would serve them well long after they left the court. Coach Stevens knew that it wasn't the flashy players who went the furthest. It was the ones who put in the work every day, who showed up with the right attitude, and who learned from their failures. And that was exactly what he had seen in these kids. As the weeks passed, the lessons of the camp continued to resonate. Zach, Jason, and the others didn't just go back to their old routines. They carried the commitment they had learned at camp into their regular lives. Zach started to rise earlier in the morning to get in extra practice before school. Jason stayed after team practice, working on his shot, putting in the extra hours to refine his technique. And slowly, their confidence grew. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was something that had become part of who they were. They weren't just trying to be good basketball players, they were trying to be the best versions of themselves, on and off the court. In the months that followed, Zach's game transformed. He wasn't the same player who had entered the camp. His skills were sharper, yes, but more than that, his approach to the game had changed. He no longer relied on his raw athleticism to carry him through. Instead, he had developed a deeper understanding of the game, the nuances, the decision-making, the teamwork. He was no longer just competing against others. He was competing against himself, pushing himself to improve every day. He had embraced the grind that MJ had exemplified. And in doing so, he had started to see the results, not just in his performance, but in his mindset. Jason's improvement, too, was evident. His shot had become more consistent. His footwork had tightened up. But more than that, he had learned how to lead. He wasn't the loudest player on the court, but he had become the glue that held the team together. His ability to read the game, to encourage his teammates, and to embrace his role had earned him the respect of his coaches and teammates alike. He had become the player everyone trusted, not because he was the flashiest or the most talented, but because he had learned to put the team first. He had learned how to make everyone around him better, and that made him invaluable. The other kids in the camp, those who had watched the transformation of Zach and Jason, also began to carry those lessons forward. They, too, understood that greatness didn't come from natural talent alone. It came from dedication, discipline, and an unyielding belief in the process. They weren't just practicing for the sake of it. They were practicing with purpose. They weren't just working on their weaknesses, they were pushing their strengths even further, making sure that their success was built on a foundation of hard work and commitment. For Coach Stevens, it was a reminder of why he coached. It wasn't the victories or the wins that mattered most. It was the process of watching young athletes grow, not just in their skills, but in their character. Over the years, he had seen countless players come and go. Some were naturally gifted, others less so. But the ones who stood out, the ones who went on to achieve something great, were the ones who had the right mentality. They were the ones who understood that greatness wasn't given to you. It was earned. And this group of kids, who had walked into the gym just a few weeks earlier with potential but no clear direction, had learned that invaluable lesson. As the months passed, the kids found themselves facing new challenges. Some played on school teams, others joined local leagues. They encountered new opponents, dealt with tough losses, and faced moments where they doubted their abilities. But each time, they drew on what they had learned at the camp. They had developed a sense of resilience, a deep understanding that no challenge was too big if they approached it with the right mindset. Zach and Jason, in particular, continued to be leaders in their respective teams. They weren't always the ones with the highest score or the biggest play, but they were the ones who worked hardest, who encouraged their teammates, who pushed through adversity. And in doing so, they became the players that everyone looked to, not because they had the most natural talent, but because they had the right mentality. The mentality of champions. And they knew that, no matter what came their way, they had already learned what it took to be great. Their journey was just beginning, but they knew they were on the right path. And that was more important than any game or victory. They had learned how to play the game the right way, and that would carry them farther than anything else ever could. The lessons they had learned at camp had shaped who they were as athletes, but even more than that, they had shaped who they were as people. And that was a legacy they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Months had passed since the camp ended, but the impact of those few transformative days still lingered in every aspect of the kids' lives. The lessons they had learned about resilience, dedication, teamwork, and the pursuit of greatness had settled deep within them. For Zach, Jason, and the other campers, life had become more than just basketball. They had learned that success was a mindset, not a momentary achievement. It was about staying focused, pushing through adversity, and never giving up, no matter how many times they stumbled. Zach, who had once been the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, now found a different kind of satisfaction. It was no longer about flashy moves or quick wins. He had learned the value of patience. He had come to understand that real growth didn't happen overnight. He wasn't the same player who had walked into the gym that first day, driven by the need to be the loudest or the best. He was quieter now, more focused. Zach was still competitive, but now he competed against himself. Every practice, every game, was a chance to get better, not just to win. He was no longer seeking approval from others. His confidence came from knowing that he was putting in the work, that he was better than he had been yesterday. Jason, too, had transformed. The quiet, reserved player who once doubted himself had become a more confident and reliable athlete. His shot had improved, yes, but it was his leadership that had truly changed. He no longer feared failure. He understood that mistakes were simply stepping stones on the path to success. Jason wasn't the loudest player, but his teammates looked to him for guidance. He had become the player who always made the right decision on the court, who knew when to pass, when to take the shot, and when to lead by example. He had learned how to elevate others around him. His confidence came not just from his own ability, but from the trust he had in his teammates and their trust in him. For the entire group, the camp had been a turning point, but the real test came when they returned to their normal lives. The lessons they learned weren't just about how to be better at basketball, they were about how to approach life with purpose, discipline, and the mindset of someone who understood that greatness wasn't handed to you. It was earned. The next season rolled around, and for Zach, Jason, and the others, it was their chance to apply everything they had absorbed. For some, that meant playing on their school teams. For others, it meant joining new leagues or pushing harder in their personal training. Regardless of where they played, the lessons they had learned at camp stuck with them. They were no longer just trying to improve, they were looking at the game with new eyes. They understood how to think through every move, how to make adjustments when things weren't going their way, and how to stay calm under pressure. They understood that the game was as much mental as it was physical. Zach's team had a solid season, and though they didn't win every game, Zach could see the difference in how they played. They were no longer a group of individuals who happened to play together. They were a team. Zach had become the player who held the team together, not because he scored the most points, but because he was the one who encouraged others, who kept everyone focused on the bigger picture. He wasn't looking for personal glory. He was focused on making sure the team succeeded, even if it meant making sacrifices for the good of the group. Jason had become the leader of his team, not by force, but by example. His steady hand in the game made everyone around him better. His coaches noticed the change, and so did his teammates. Jason's shot was no longer just a weapon, it was a tool in his larger game plan. He was no longer just an individual trying to prove himself, he had become the player who understood the importance of creating opportunities for others. He had learned how to balance his own growth with the growth of the team. Throughout the season, the kids who had attended the camp together remained in contact. They shared stories of their successes and their struggles. When one of them struggled with their shooting, they would share drills or advice. When one of them got frustrated with a game or a loss, the others reminded them of the lessons they had learned at camp. The bond they had formed wasn't just about basketball, it was about the shared experience of growth. They had all been through something together, and that connection had carried them through even the toughest moments of the season. As the season came to an end, the team that Zach and Jason played for had qualified for the championship. It wasn't an easy road, there had been losses, close calls, and games where they thought they wouldn't make it. But they had made it. And now, they were standing on the precipice of something they had all dreamed about. The championship game was set. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for, everything they had fought through. The night before the game, Zach sat alone in the gym. The lights were dimmed, and the sound of the basketball echoing off the court was the only noise in the building. He dribbled the ball slowly, lost in thought. It wasn't the first time he had played in a big game, but this one felt different. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't worried about what others would think. He was ready. He had put in the work, he had learned the lessons, and he knew he had done everything he could to get to this point. He thought back to the camp, the drills, the shooting contests, the long hours spent practicing. But more than that, he thought about MJ's words, his quiet confidence, and his unrelenting pursuit of greatness. It wasn't about the accolades. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing up, every day, and putting in the work. And that was the mindset Zach had adopted. Jason found him in the gym a few minutes later. He leaned against the bleachers, watching Zach for a while before speaking. "You good?" he asked. Zach didn't immediately respond. He just nodded, then looked up at his teammate. "Yeah. Just thinking." Jason grinned. "You've got this, man. We've got this." The next day, they took the court for the championship game. It was fast, intense, and every minute felt like an eternity. But the difference was clear. Zach and Jason were no longer the same players who had walked into that gym months ago. They played with a calm, focused intensity. They worked together, anticipating each other's moves, communicating without words. When they faced setbacks, they didn't let it shake them. They simply focused on what was next. The game came down to the final seconds, with their team holding a narrow lead. Zach, with the ball in his hands, could feel the weight of the moment. The gym was silent, the crowd holding its breath. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't rush. He didn't panic. He passed the ball to Jason, who took the shot. It went in. The buzzer sounded. They had won. As the team celebrated, Zach and Jason shared a moment. It wasn't the trophy that mattered. It wasn't the crowd's applause. It was the understanding that the true victory had come from everything they had learned along the way. The championship was a culmination of their efforts, but it was the lessons, the mindset, the dedication, the resilience that had gotten them there. And as they stood together, they knew that this was just the beginning.